The chill that ran through me was not from the mountain air, nor the dampness of the ancient cloister, but from a deeper, more primal place. My mind, ever the skeptic, tried to rationalize it, a trick of light, a muscle spasm in my own eye, the insidious suggestiveness of the monks' earlier admonition echoing in the cavernous space. But I stood there, rooted, staring at the grey, unyielding face of what was supposedly a depiction of St. Jude. His eyes, previously empty and fixed, now seemed to hold a flicker of something, knowing. It was unsettling enough that I decided, right then, that I would leave the heavy cleaning of the central courtyard statues to someone else. I volunteered for the archives, a far dustier, but surely less psychically demanding task. I should have recognized that desperate shift in duties for the profound error in judgment it was. The archive was a sanctuary of forgotten knowledge, a labyrinth of shelves groaning under the weight of centuries. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that penetrated the high, stained glass windows, illuminating forgotten histories, illuminated manuscripts, and the quiet decay of parchment. It was here, amongst the meticulously catalogued but rarely disturbed records, that the monks' warnings took on a new, more sinister dimension. I found myself drawn not to the official histories of the order, nor the theological treatises, but to the marginalia, the forbidden appendices, the volumes bound in plain, unmarked leather that were tucked away in the deepest, least accessible corners. These weren't just dusty books. They were whispers made manifest, bound not by glue and thread, but by fear and desperate secrecy. There was a certain heaviness to them, a palpable dread emanating from their very presence, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature of the vault. One evening, while cross-referencing an obscure papal bull from the 14th century, I stumbled upon a slim, unmarked codex, its pages brittle, smelling faintly of something metallic, like dried blood or ancient iron. Liber Tenebris was inscribed on its first page in a spidery, almost illegible hand, a crude drawing of a multifaceted eye beneath the title. This wasn't a standard religious text. It was a compendium of redacted histories, unholy rituals, and detailed accounts of entities whispered to exist beyond the veil. It spoke of certain Vatican conspiracies, not political machinations, but spiritual pacts and forbidden knowledge hidden for centuries, sealed away for the supposed protection of humanity. It described a secret conclave, formed not by cardinals, but by shadow-bound monks, who guarded not relics, but the very edges of reality. I confess, initially I dismissed it as mad rambling, the ravings of some heretic or particularly creative zealot. But as I read deeper, my breath catching in my throat, the details began to coalesce into something chillingly coherent. The text described how certain sacred statues, like those in the courtyard, were not merely artistic representations, but vessels, anchors for something ancient and hungry. It spoke of a perpetual vigil, a constant feed of silent observation that kept the entities contained, yet perpetually aware. The monks' hushed warnings, their averted gazes, they weren't just superstition. They were a liturgy, a desperate plea to avoid drawing attention to oneself, to not awaken what had been carefully lulled into a state of suspended animation. My skepticism, once a sturdy shield, began to buckle under the weight of this impossible revelation. The Liber Tenebris contained entire chapters dedicated to what it called the nomen non dictum, the names not spoken. These were not names in any human sense, but guttural incantations, resonant frequencies that, when uttered, were said to resonate with the anchored entities, drawing their awareness, or worse, their hunger, to the speaker. There were intricate diagrams of complex sigils, elaborate rituals involving candlelight, specific celestial alignments, and substances that turned my stomach to merely read about. The text warned, with chilling clarity, that even to think the full nomen was to open a door that could never truly be closed. My nights in the archive grew longer, my sleep haunted by fragmented images from the text, by the feeling of unseen eyes boring into me even in the dark. I started seeing movement in the periphery of my vision, hearing faint, guttural whispers just at the edge of hearing, like a radio tuning into a station far beyond human comprehension. My psychological breakdown was slow, insidious, masquerading as feverish scholarship. One particularly cold night, driven by a morbid fascination I now understand as a cruel compulsion, I found myself tracing the lines of a complex sigil with my finger, muttering the preamble to a lesser summoning ritual described in the Liber Tenebris. I thought I was simply studying, observing, never truly believing. But as I softly intoned a fragment of a name I would never dare to write down, the air in the archive grew impossibly heavy. The single oil lamp flickered violently, casting monstrous shadows that writhed across the bookshelves. A faint, low thrumming began, not in my ears, but in my very bones, a vibration that felt ancient and immense. Then, from somewhere deep within the monastery, a sound reached me, a soft, grinding scrape, like stone moving against stone, followed by a profound, echoing sigh. It was the sound of something awakening, something that had been patiently waiting, and I had, in my ignorant hubris, finally given it the cue it needed. I froze, the blood draining from my face, my hand still poised over the unholy text. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The feeling of being watched intensified, no longer a subtle paranoia, but an undeniable, suffocating presence. I scrambled backwards, knocking over a stack of ancient scrolls, the papyrus crackling like dry bones. I could feel the cold, stony gaze of something from the courtyard, even through the thick walls, even through the very earth. It was no longer a trick of the light, no longer a tired imagination. The statues had been merely holding their breath, and I, fool that I was, had exhaled for them. I now carry the weight of that knowledge, the certainty of what I have inadvertently woken, like a brand burned into my very soul. I still hear the scraping, even now, even when I am far away, and I know it is coming for me. I remember it vividly, the chill that settled deeper than the ancient stone of the crypt, not from the temperature, but from an undeniable sense of wrongness. The Grand Prior, Father Elias, had assigned me the maintenance of the lower catacombs, a task usually reserved for the most junior novices. But I was new, a visiting scholar, and perhaps they thought my academic detachment would make me less susceptible to the old wives' tales that clung to these parts of the abbey. The primary task was simple, dusty work, cataloguing ossuaries, polishing reliquaries, and most notably, cleaning the rows of shrouded, life-sized statues that stood sentinel in the deepest alcoves. These weren't the traditional saints, no beatific smiles or symbols of martyrdom. Their faces were stark, almost expressionless, carved from a dark, veined marble that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The monks, as the chapter title suggests, gave them a wide berth. I noticed it almost immediately. When they came for their infrequent, hushed prayers down here, usually for a deceased brother, or during some obscure vigil, their candles clustered against the farthest walls, throwing long, dancing shadows that stretched towards the statues but never illuminated them directly. It was a conscious act, a palpable avoidance. I dismissed it at first, as a peculiar local custom, perhaps an extreme form of humility before sacred ancestors, or simply an aesthetic choice to keep these figures in perpetual twilight. My academic mind, trained to observe and categorize, wasn't yet equipped to recognize the language of fear. I kept cleaning, kept brushing the millennia of dust from those unnervingly fine lips and eyes that were, even then, too alive. One afternoon, I lingered too long, lost in the intricate carving of a particularly imposing figure. It was a woman, cloaked and hooded, her hands clasped in what could have been prayer or the restraint of something struggling within. Her face was serene, yet a subtle tension in the jawline, a faint furrow in the brow, hinted at an immense internal struggle. As I ran my cloth over the cold marble, tracing the line of her cheekbone, a sudden, rough grip tightened around my wrist. It was Brother Thomas, an older monk, usually placid and almost spectral in his quiet movements. His grip was surprisingly strong, his hand shaking violently. His eyes, usually clouded with age, were wide and stark with an ancient, raw terror. "Don't let them notice you," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp, barely audible over the profound silence of the crypt. The warning hung in the air, heavy and noxious. I wanted to ask what he meant, to demand an explanation, But his face, pale and etched with dread, told me that pressing the matter would only deepen his anguish, or worse, wake something best left sleeping. He pulled me away, his eyes never quite meeting mine, but constantly darting to the shadowed figures, as if expecting them to move. I should have stopped then. I knew something was profoundly wrong. The terror in Brother Thomas's eyes was not born of superstition. It was a primal, visceral fear that only comes from direct, undeniable experience. But my curiosity, that insatiable, insidious academic curiosity, had already taken root. The seed had been planted by those haunting eyes carved into the marble, and Brother Thomas's warning merely watered it. I began to spend more time down there, ostensibly cleaning, but truly observing. I started to notice things the others perhaps chose to ignore or had become too accustomed to. The air around the statues, for instance, was always colder, a biting chill that didn't dissipate even after hours of my presence. The dust, no matter how meticulously I cleaned, seemed to return faster to their faces, as if they were constantly breathing it in. It was while I was cleaning the pedestal of the very figure Brother Thomas had warned me about, the cloaked woman, that I made my first, irreversible discovery. My fingers brushed against a barely perceptible seam in the marble, hidden by centuries of grime and clever craftsmanship. It was a small, almost invisible panel. With a breath I didn't realize I was holding, I pressed, and with a soft, grinding sigh of ancient stone, it gave way. Inside, nestled within a hollowed recess, was not a relic or a jewel, but a single, fragile scroll of vellum, yellowed and brittle with age. It was bound by a thin, desiccated leather thong. My hands trembled as I unrolled it. The script was an archaic form of Latin, interwoven with strange, angular glyphs I couldn't immediately place. It wasn't a narrative, not a prayer, but something far more unsettling. A list. A list of names, but not human names. Each name was followed by a series of precise, disturbing symbols, almost like mathematical equations for terror. One phrase, repeated throughout the text, burned itself into my memory. Vox clamantis in tenebris, nomen invocato per umbras. A voice crying in the darkness, a name invoked by shadows. The chilling implication settled over me like a shroud. These weren't just names, they were keys. Keys to doors I never knew existed, doors best left locked. I felt a profound shift in the atmosphere. The silence of the crypt was no longer empty, it was laden, watchful. The shadows, which had merely stretched towards the statues, now seemed to deepen around them, to coalesce. I looked up from the scroll, my heart hammering against my ribs, and met the eyes of the cloaked woman. Or perhaps her gaze met mine. I thought I was imagining it, a trick of the flickering candle, but the subtle tension in her jaw seemed more pronounced, the furrow in her brow deeper. Her carved lips, moments ago just stone, now seemed to possess a faint, almost imperceptible curve, as if on the verge of articulation. A whisper, perhaps, a soundless inhalation. The text spoke of ancient pacts, of guardians, and of the precarious balance between silence and awakening. It detailed the proper methods of appeasement, not with prayers or offerings, but with ignorance, with unseeing eyes and unhearing ears. To know them, the scroll implied, was to invite them to know you. And I had known. I had touched their history, read their language, breathed in their names. The words on the scroll were not meant for human eyes, certainly not for human understanding, and most certainly not for human invocation. Nomen invocato, a name invoked. Even silently, in the privacy of my own mind, the act of reading them, of committing them to memory, was an invocation, a calling. The air grew heavy, thick with something unseen. A pressure built behind my eyes, a dull throb that pulsed in time with my racing heart. My breath hitched in my throat. I was no longer merely cleaning statues in a quiet abbey crypt. I was in a sacred, terrible space, and I had just broken every unspoken rule. The cold was no longer just the stone. It was an internal chill, an icy tendril unwinding in the pit of my stomach. The silence around me was no longer peaceful. It was a profound, waiting stillness, expectant. I felt 1,000 eyes upon me, unseen, unblinking, the awareness of their presence a physical weight. They had noticed me. I still feel the weight of their gaze. even now, far from the abbey, in the supposed safety of my own thoughts. I tell myself, even now, that I am a scholar, a man of logic, devoted to the dispassionate pursuit of knowledge. But that is a lie I can no longer maintain, a pretense that crumbles with every flickering shadow. I avoided their faces. For months, I moved through the echoing halls of this isolated compound, skirting the periphery of the vast chamber where the statues stood, their silent ranks an unnerving presence. My work, an exhaustive cataloguing of forgotten liturgical texts, occupied my days and nights, providing a convenient excuse to keep my gaze fixed on parchment, on scripture, anywhere but the cold, staring eyes of the carved figures that lined the walls. I knew, intuitively, that to truly look was to invite something unwelcome, to acknowledge a sentience that defied all reason and comfort. My routine was meticulous, a bulwark against the creeping dread this place exuded. Every night before retiring, I would carry a single bucket of water from the ancient well to my sparse living quarters, a small ritual of mundane normalcy in an otherwise abnormal existence. The bucket, heavy and cold against my leg, was simply a vessel, a means to an end. It was on one such night, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and something vaguely metallic, that my careful avoidance shattered. A shard of moonlight, cutting through a high, grimy window, caught the surface of the water as I paused to adjust my grip, casting a distorted, watery sheen. And then I saw it. Not my own tired, shadowed face, as it usually was, but a reflection from one of the statues nearest the window. It was the face of the weeper, a robed figure, its head bowed, perpetually veiled in shadow, carved with exquisite, disturbing detail. I'd always dismissed its eyes as empty hollows, artistic conventions, but in the water, caught in that brief, shimmering reflection, they were not empty. They were dark, yes, but deep, and for an impossible, agonizing moment, they blinked. A slow, deliberate movement of stone eyelids, like dust motes settling or perhaps rising. I should have screamed. I should have spilled the water, dropped the bucket, run from the hall and never looked back. But I didn't. Instead, I stared. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. The surface of the water, which moments before had been still, rippled gently, as if disturbed by an unseen current. And in that ripple, the reflected face seemed to shift, the downturned mouth of the weeper twisting upwards, a faint, unsettling curl. It was gone as quickly as it came, a trick of the light, a distortion of the water, a figment of my overwrought imagination. But for a single, horrifying heartbeat, I thought the statue smiled at me, a predatory, knowing smile that spoke of secrets and hunger. I wrenched my gaze from the bucket, turning abruptly, my neck stiff, to face the actual statue. It stood motionless, as it always did, its head bowed, its face obscured. Or had it moved, just a fraction? My mind reeled, grasping for a rational explanation. When I finally forced myself to look back at the water bucket, the true horror set in. My reflection was gone, utterly vanished. Where my own eyes, my own fear-stricken face should have been, there was only the carved face of the weeper staring back, perfectly clear, utterly still. The eyes, though no longer blinking, held a terrible, unwavering gaze that penetrated me to my very core. It was not a reflection of the statue anymore. It was the statue, somehow imprinted, absorbed, made manifest in the water. What does it mean when stone sees you but refuses to release your image? The question echoed in my skull, a cold, alien whisper. It meant I was marked, I was seen, and the casual disregard I had shown these entities was now impossible. The bucket slipped from my numb fingers, clattering loudly on the ancient flagstones, the water sloshing over the floor. I didn't care. The sound, the mess, meant nothing. All that existed was the cold, unyielding gaze of the stone face, still shimmering in the spilled water, now fractured into a dozen smaller, equally unnerving reflections. I fled, stumbled through the echoing halls, the image burned behind my eyelids, a brand of unimaginable horror. My sleep that night was a fractured landscape of nightmares, of stone eyes following me, of silent, rippling smiles, and the chilling realization that my world had fundamentally, irrevocably shifted. I was no longer merely cataloguing forgotten texts. I was caught in the forgotten current of this place. I should have stopped there. I should have packed my bags, abandoned my post, fled this accursed monastery, citing illness or an urgent family matter. Any excuse would have sufficed. But the scholar in me, perhaps the same obsessive flaw that led me here, would not allow it. The terror was overwhelming, yes, but it was coupled with a desperate, burning need to understand. What was this place? What were these statues? My previous academic work, focused on esoteric Christian symbolism and apocryphal gospels, had granted me access to certain restricted archives. Now, I saw the true purpose of those forbidden shelves. I now understood why the Vatican Guard kept such a vigilant, silent watch over particular wings of their libraries, and why certain ancient orders dedicated themselves to the sealing of knowledge, not its dissemination. The days that followed were a blur of frantic research. I delved into the monastery's own restricted collection, texts often brittle and worm-eaten, bound in dark, unfamiliar leathers. I found references to pre-Christian cults, to witnessing stones and silent sentinels, to a lineage of entities that predated human consciousness, slumbering through ages, roused only by specific alignments, or horrifyingly, by being perceived. There were cryptic allusions to the names that bring form, whispered among certain clandestine sects. These were not mere titles, but incantations, resonant vibrations meant to bridge the gap between realms. I read of rituals involving water, reflections, and the deliberate imbuing of inanimate objects with a sliver of this primal consciousness. Verbum sat sapienti, a word to the wise is enough, but I consumed every word, every forbidden syllable. The more I read, the more I understood that my experience with the Weeper was not an isolated incident, but an initiation. I had been noticed, selected, perhaps even imprinted. The text spoke of those who were seen by the stones, how their reflections would vanish, leaving only the stone's image as a permanent marker. It wasn't just a psychological terror, it was a metaphysical theft. My image, my essence, was now held by something ancient and patient, a silent watcher that had finally turned its gaze upon me. The air grew colder in the halls, the shadows deeper, and every corner seemed to hold a pair of unblinking eyes. I felt a constant, prickling sensation on my skin, as if 1,000 unseen eyes were scrutinizing my every move, every breath. The paranoia is no longer a delusion. It is a profound, undeniable truth. The books warned against seeking these truths, against disturbing the ancient slumber. They warned that some knowledge, once acquired, cannot be unlearned, and its consequences cannot be outrun. I walk these halls now, an unwilling participant in a game I never chose to play, my mind a cacophony of forbidden names and chilling rituals. The cold, lifeless stone has eyes, and those eyes are on me. They saw me, and now I belong to them. It began subtly, as all true horrors do, not with a roar but with a whisper of displacement. The statues, these silent, chiseled sentinels of the cloister, have always been part of the landscape here, as immutable as the stones they stand upon. But lately I've felt them. Not seen, not heard, but felt their proximity change, like a minor shift in atmospheric pressure. A St. Jude, for instance, typically resided in the east alcove, overlooking the herb gardens. Yet 3 nights ago, I found him closer to the refectory entrance, his sightless eyes fixed on the chapel archway. I remember the exact chill that ran down my spine, an icy premonition that something profound and profoundly wrong was unfolding in the sacred quiet. I confess my curiosity, that most dangerous of human vices, got the better of me. The next morning I dared to approach Brother Thomas, an older Benedictine whose eyes held the weary wisdom of centuries. I described the shifting statues, perhaps too casually, hopping for a mundane explanation, a cleaning crew, a special procession. But his reaction was anything but mundane. His lips, usually soft with prayer, thinned into a tight, condemnatory line. He stared at me with an unsettling intensity, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Do not measure their distance," he warned, the words scraping against my composure. "To notice is to be chosen." The implication hung heavy in the air, a bell tolling for an fate I was only just beginning to grasp. But how could I not notice? The very act of being warned had sharpened my perceptions, turning every shadow into a potential shift, every creak of the old stones into a step. My duties as an archivist, ostensibly mundane, had given me an unprecedented access to the labyrinthine passages beneath the basilica, the forgotten wings of the Vatican Library. It was in one such neglected crypt, a section marked with the antiquated Latin inscription, Procul hinc, procul est profani. Away from here, away, you uninitiated, that the true descent began. I had been cataloguing some discarded missives, documents deemed too heretical even for destruction, when my hand brushed against a hidden catch. A small, almost imperceptible panel slid open, revealing a dusty alcove. Inside lay a single tome, bound in leather so dark it seemed to absorb light, its pages brittle with age. No title adorned its spine, only a series of enigmatic sigils etched in silver. Against every fiber of self-preservation, I retrieved it. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I wiped away centuries of dust, the scent of parchment and something else, something metallic and ancient, filling my nostrils. I should have stopped when I saw the first glyphs, symbols that twisted the Holy Cross into something blasphemous, but I kept reading. I kept turning the pages, each one a step deeper into an abyss I now know I was never meant to witness. The language within was a corrupt variant of Old Latin, interspersed with other tongues I barely recognized, yet understood with a frightening clarity. It spoke of unbeings, entities preceding the very concept of divinity, capable of traversing dimensions not through space, but through recognition. It detailed rituals not of worship, but of observation, of acknowledgement. The crucial part, the horrifying truth, lay in a specific chapter, De Statuis Vivantibus, of living statues. It described their purpose: silent watchers, sentinels placed at points of high spiritual confluence or where the veil between worlds was thinnest. Their movement was not physical, but existential. They relocated when their presence was registered, when their patient vigil was finally broken by a conscious mind. To notice is to be chosen. Brother Thomas's words echoed, no longer a warning, but a confirmation. I thought I was imagining it until the next morning. My route to the archives takes me through the main cloister, where the St. Michael statue had stood vigil by the fountain for decades. Now a St. Catherine, usually positioned by the scriptorium, occupied his place. St. Michael was gone. Not merely moved, but gone, as if the space he inhabited had simply been swapped. The sheer impossibility of it should have driven me mad, but instead, it merely sharpened the terror. The book was not metaphor, it was a manual. The statues weren't just stone, they were instruments. The text also spoke of nomen vacuus, the empty names, words that were not merely labels but resonant frequencies, capable of calling forth attention, drawing the gaze of these ancient things. There was a section dedicated to the architects of silence, the hidden order within the church that had protected, and perhaps secretly served, these entities for millennia. Vatican conspiracies were no longer abstract theories. They were living, breathing horrors unfolding around me. I started to see the subtle signs, the coded gestures, the hushed conversations among certain cardinals, men whose faces now seemed carved from the same impassive stone as the figures in the cloister. Now my mop skims the stones each night, and I no longer merely feel their breath on my neck. I hear it, a faint, dry rustling like ancient draperies stirred by a wind that doesn't exist. Sometimes I catch glimpses in my peripheral vision, a shoulder turning, a head inclining slightly. But when I snap my gaze, they are always still, always just stone. My sanity is fraying at the edges, a threadbare tapestry pulled taut by the relentless, silent pursuit. The names from the book whisper in my dreams, becoming more than mere words. They become a call, an invitation, and I am the one who sent it. I feel their cold, patient eyes on me constantly now, no longer just in the cloister, but in my small quarters, in the echoing silence of the archives. They are closer every night, aren't they? I've been chosen, not for grace, but for something far more terrible. The greatest error was believing that knowledge was a weapon. It was merely a key, and I unlocked my own prison. The initial certainty felt like bedrock beneath my feet, a comfort in this ancient, silent monastery. 12 statues. I had catalogued them meticulously. St. Michael with his sword poised, St. Catherine clutching her wheel, St. Jude Thaddeus, the patron of lost causes, and so on. A perfectly ordered pantheon of devotion. each figure carved with the solemn artistry typical of the late Gothic period, lining the nave of the old chapel. My initial research into the monastery's foundation had confirmed this number, along with their purported histories, their relics, their feast days. They were, in essence, anchors in a turbulent sea of esoteric texts and whispered heresies that had become my daily bread. I sketched them, photographed them, even spent hours transcribing the barely legible Latin inscriptions at their bases, thinking them nothing more than historical artifacts. How terribly, foolishly, I clung to that prosaic reality. The first tremor struck after a particularly grueling night, poring over the Liber Obscura Somnia, a Franciscan text rumored to have been suppressed by the Vatican in the 16th century, filled with oblique references to shifting presences and counted awakenings. My eyes, strained and red, found the chapel a temporary reprieve from the dizzying labyrinth of ancient script. I walked the familiar aisle, my gaze drifting over the familiar forms. But then, a subtle dissonance. My internal tally, usually instantaneous, snagged. I stopped, a prickle of unease snaking up my spine. My gaze darted back to the altar, then to the wall, counting slowly, deliberately, whispering the names under my breath. 1, 2, 3, and there it was. A figure, slender and indistinct, its features shrouded in shadow, standing where I knew, absolutely knew, there had been only wall. 13. 13, my mind reeled. The light was poor, the moon barely piercing the high lancet windows, casting long, distorted shadows. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, an exhaustion-induced hallucination. I rubbed my eyes, pinched the bridge of my nose, then counted again. Still 13. The additional figure seemed to shimmer at the periphery of my vision, almost too present, yet too ephemeral to properly grasp. It wore no familiar vestments, carried no discernible attributes. Just a form, a presence, unnervingly still. A cold dread settled in my stomach, the kind that whispers of boundaries crossed and forbidden thresholds. I should have stopped then. I should have walked away, rationalized it as sleep deprivation, and never returned. But the scholar's itch, the insatiable need to know, was already festering. The next morning the sun streamed into the chapel, illuminating every dust motes dancing in the air. I rushed back, my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting to find the illusion dispelled. But there it stood, undeniable now in the unforgiving light. The 13th figure. It was subtly different from the others, less polished, its stone a darker, almost volcanic hue, as if not carved but coalesced. I approached it slowly, my hand extended, hovering inches from its surface. It was cold, colder than the surrounding air, an unholy cold. I scanned its base, searching for an inscription, a name, anything to identify this anomaly, but found only rough, unworked stone. This was not merely an added statue. It was a foreign object, an intrusion. I sought out Brother Elias, the oldest and most stoic of the resident monks, a man whose face was a roadmap of asceticism. I described my finding, trying to maintain an academic calm, carefully omitting the more visceral elements of my dread. He listened, his eyes unblinking, his hands clasped tightly. When I finished, he simply stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked away, not a word uttered. I pressed him, catching up near the refectory. "Brother, there are 13 statues now. You must have noticed." His response was swift and brutal. He slammed the heavy oak door of the refectory directly in my face, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the cloister. The message was clear: silence. Not ignorance, but an enforced, willful silence. A conspiracy of omission. That refusal to acknowledge, that deliberate, almost violent rejection of my observation, solidified the horror. They knew. They knew, and they were either terrified or complicit. My notes, which had been so meticulous, now seemed to unravel before my eyes. My initial diagram of the chapel, marked with 12 numbered circles, mocked me from the page. I felt a growing vertigo, as if the ground beneath my feet was losing its solidity. Was I truly seeing things? Or were they all engaged in some elaborate, gaslighting ritual? The idea of losing my mind was almost preferable to the alternative, that the numbers, the very bedrock of objective reality, could be so easily, fluidly defied. I returned to the chapel that afternoon, driven by a desperate need for confirmation, for anything to anchor myself. The sun was dipping, painting the stained glass in fiery hues. My breath hitched. Now there were only 11. 11. The 13th was gone, of course, but so was one of the original 12. A vacant plinth stood where the statue of St. Agnes, clutching her lamb, had been. It wasn't fallen, it was simply absent. The space was empty, dusted, as if nothing had ever stood there. My head throbbed, a relentless drumbeat against my temples. My notes now contradicted themselves not once, but twice over. 12, then 13, then 11. This wasn't a mistake in counting. This was an active manipulation of perception, of reality itself. I remembered a passage from the Codex Gigas, a forbidden text I'd studied months ago, describing how entities from the outer dark could manifest by being counted, by being given form through acknowledgement. Numeri vocant, it had warned et vocati mutant. The numbers call, and the called ones change. Was this what was happening? Had my innocent act of counting, of cataloguing, somehow brought this shifting reality into being? Was the act of perception itself the ritual? The statues were not simply static representations. They were a ledger, a dynamic tally of what? Of entities traversing a boundary, of something entering and leaving this plane of existence, using the stone figures as temporary anchors or perhaps as a macabre abacus. The thought twisted in my gut. What if the monks weren't just covering up an anomaly, but actively participating in a vigil, a desperate attempt to maintain a balance or perhaps to control the flow? And I, in my arrogance, my relentless pursuit of forgotten knowledge, had unwittingly disrupted it. I was no longer an observer. I was implicated. The forbidden texts weren't just academic curiosities. They were instruction manuals, warnings, and now my personal doom. The Liber Obscura Somnia had spoken of those who look too closely, of those who see what is not meant to be seen, becoming the first of the new count. What did that even mean? My memory feels like a sieve, leaking certainty with every passing hour. I try to recall the exact order of the 12, but the gaps are multiplying. Faces blur, attributes shift, and sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I swear I see a flicker, a subtle movement among the remaining figures, as if they are merely holding still, waiting for me to turn my back. What if they are not just statues, but a roster? And what happens when the final number is reached? Or worse, when a particular number is missing? The chill that now permeates my bones has nothing to do with the monastery's damp stone, and everything to do with the dread knowledge that I have become irrevocably entangled in a game of numbers I was never meant to play. I should have never opened that chapel door, let alone started counting. Brother Thomas is gone. Not dead, not relocated, simply gone. His absence in this rigidly structured monastery is less a void and more a perfectly excised cavity, leaving no trace, no ripple. No one speaks his name. It's as if he never existed, a fact more terrifying than any obituary. One day he was there, a stooped figure with perpetually flower-dusted robes, muttering to himself in the scriptorium. The next, his cell door stood ajar, revealing an emptiness so profound it felt deliberately cultivated. Every personal item, every scrap of paper, every single, insignificant belonging, purged. The stone floor gleamed with an unnerving, recent polish. The air in his tiny chamber felt surgically sterile, scrubbed clean of any human presence, as if even the memory of his breath had been vacuumed from the very molecules. It wasn't a departure, it was an erasure. My initial unease festered, turning into a cold, hard knot of dread in my stomach. I felt it most acutely in the cloisters, that sheltered walk where the monks often gather in silent contemplation. It was there, just a few days after Thomas's inexplicable disappearance, that I saw it, the newest addition to the small, unassuming garden of statuary. A figure, perhaps 3/4 life-size, rendered in a muted, mottled grey stone that caught the pale morning light. My breath hitched. The tilt of the head, the precise, almost imperceptible furrow above the left eye, the way the robes draped just so over a slightly bowed shoulder, it was Brother Thomas. Unmistakably him, down to the peculiar bend in his nose I always found endearing. A perfect, silent sentinel, yet imbued with an uncanny, almost painful familiarity. My mind reeled. Corpus petrifactum. Body made stone. I recalled the obscure Hermetic texts I had clandestinely devoured in the restricted archives, the whispered tales of the sculptor's enemy, who, it was said, could transfigure the living into works of enduring art, preserving their essence, their very soul, in an unyielding form. I dismissed it, of course, as esoteric madness, academic conjecture. But standing before that statue, seeing Thomas's features so perfectly rendered, I could feel a horrifying truth pressing against the fragile walls of my sanity. I thought I was imagining it, a phantom of grief or exhaustion, but the more I looked, the more certain I became. The other monks, those few who even glanced at the new addition, seemed not to notice the resemblance, or perhaps they actively chose not to. Their gazes were blank, their expressions placid, almost artificially so. My attempts to subtly broach the subject were met with immediate, chilling silence. Brother Jerome, usually garrulous, suddenly found an intense fascination with his breviary. Brother Michael, who often shared a knowing smile, now regarded me with eyes that seemed to hold ancient, frozen secrets. A wall of impenetrable silence descended, thicker and more oppressive than any stone. This wasn't just a collective avoidance. It was a deliberate, synchronized act of suppression, an unspoken covenant that solidified my fear. It suggested a complicity that reached far beyond these walls, perhaps even brushing against the very vestments of the Curia itself. The Vatican, I realized, held more than just doctrine. It held unspeakable, living history, far darker than any theologian dared to admit. Then came the nights, not the usual monastic quiet, but a new, dreadful hum. Low, guttural, a chorus of voices, barely a whisper, yet vibrating through the very flagstones of my cell. It wasn't the beautiful, soaring chant of matins or lauds. This was a rhythmic, almost tribal drone, raw and primal. I would press my ear against the cold stone, straining to decipher the unintelligible sounds. They were chanting, yes, but not in praise or supplication. It was a binding, verba ligatura. Binding words, as if trying to tether something back into stillness, to anchor it, or perhaps to complete a dreadful, irreversible process. I pictured them, gathered in some hidden crypt, their faces illuminated by flickering candlelight, eyes fixed on some unseen focal point, voices weaving a net of sound designed to capture and hold. And my mind would always return to the statue, to Thomas, to the unspeakable alchemy I had read about, the opus magnum of flesh made Petra. Were they binding his restless spirit, or were they binding the very essence of the stone, ensuring its grim permanence? The knowledge I've gleaned from those forbidden books, the ones I should have never touched, now feels less like wisdom and more like a terminal disease eating away at my peace. I should have stopped when I first found the hidden compartment behind the false wall in the archive, when the dust on the ancient scrolls made me cough blood for a week. But I kept reading, driven by an insatiable, academic curiosity, believing myself immune to the superstitions I catalogued. Now sleep offers no respite, only vivid, terrifying dreams of grey hands reaching, of skin hardening, of lungs filling with dust instead of air. Every shadow plays tricks on my eyes. Every creak of the ancient timbers sounds like a footfall. I see Brother Thomas's face in every new piece of masonry, in the rough grain of my wooden table, even horrifyingly in the distorted reflection in my own tired, dilated pupils. The paranoia is a constant companion, a cold breath on my neck. I feel their eyes on me now, the collective, knowing gaze of the Brotherhood, watching my subtle attempts to understand, to uncover. They know I know. The truth is a horrifying, crystalline thing now, too sharp to ignore. If Brother Thomas disappeared, and then a statue of him appeared, the connection is not coincidental. It is a process, a ritual, an act of unholy creation. And the terrifying, chilling question from the prompt echoes in the silence of my cell, no longer an abstract fear, but a visceral dread. If statues can be carved from flesh, who will be next? The answer, like a death knell, rings with a dreadful certainty in my soul. I have seen what I was never meant to see, learned what was never meant to be known, and now the monastery walls, once a sanctuary of quiet study, feel like the thick, unyielding walls of a tomb. There is no escape from this terrible knowledge, no turning back. And I find myself constantly checking the new sculptures arriving each week, searching for familiar faces. I still feel the phantom sting of his palm against my cheek, a brutal mercy delivered by a man whose face I barely recall, lost in the inferno of that moment. His hand, calloused and strong, yanked me back from the precipice, from the gaping maw of whatever it was I had stared into. He said, "They see you now," and the words weren't a warning. They were a definitive statement, a pronouncement of doom. The sensation of being seen didn't dissipate with the physical blow. It intensified, a cold, probing tendril that had taken root in the deepest chambers of my mind, a foreign presence that now scrutinizes my every thought, my every breath. It's a relentless, insidious awareness, a certainty that I am no longer alone in my own skin. My research into the Vatican's hidden archives, a clandestine pursuit that always felt too thrilling, too dangerous, now seems like a lifetime ago. I thought I was simply uncovering forgotten truths, unearthing the suppressed history of the Church, the esoteric rituals, the whispers of ancient pacts. Fool. I was an acolyte, naive and arrogant, delving into matters best left untouched, seeking knowledge that was never meant for mortal understanding. The grimoires, the palimpsests, the brittle scrolls, all meticulously catalogued under layers of bureaucratic obfuscation. They were not just historical documents. They were conduits, spellbooks, bestiaries of the soul, and I, in my hubris, mistook them for dusty curiosities. The warnings were there, embedded in the marginalia of those forbidden texts, in the coded Latin phrases that spoke of oculi sine corpore, eyes without bodies, and voces ab abyssa, voices from the abyss. I dismissed them as poetic allegory, as primitive superstition, the frantic scribblings of monks driven to madness by solitude and self-imposed privation. I should have stopped when I first deciphered the true nature of the anathema scripta, a category of texts so dangerous they were not merely banned, but ritually cursed, each word infused with a palpable dread designed to repel. But I kept reading, driven by an academic curiosity that has now become my undoing. The dreams began subtly. Not nightmares, not initially, but a dull, insistent hum at the back of my skull, a low-frequency vibration that vibrated through my waking hours. Then came the faces, stone-hewn, devoid of warmth or life, yet undeniably observing. In my sleep they turned, slowly, deliberately, their eyes, those same black, bottomless pits, fixated on me. Their mouths open not to scream, but to form my name, a guttural sound that vibrates through my bones, stripping away my sense of self. It's not a calling, but an affirmation of their knowledge, an acknowledgement that I am theirs now. Codex, codex. I thought I was imagining it until the whispers began to bleed into my waking world. At first, it was the rustle of leaves outside my window, too articulate, too close to my ear. Then, the creak of an old floorboard in an empty room, sounding distinctly like a sigh. Now, it is the faint murmur in the periphery of my hearing, a chorus of sibilant voices that seem to emanate from every shadowed corner, from the static on the radio, from the hum of the refrigerator. They are always just beyond comprehension, a fragmented word here, a chilling cadence there, but the underlying message is clear. They are here. They are watching. They are waiting. The paranoia is a tangible weight, a crushing burden that makes every mundane task an exercise in terror. I check the locks 3, 4, 5 times. I peer into reflective surfaces, half expecting to see a distortion, a flicker of something monstrous peering over my shoulder. My reflection, once familiar, now seems alien, the eyes too wide, the shadows under them too deep, as if the person looking back at me is merely a vessel, already compromised. The world feels thinner, stretched taut, revealing the dark, writhing mass that lies beneath. Every shadow seems to deepen, every sound sharpens into a potential threat. I recall a specific passage from the Liber Tenebrarum, a tome bound in what felt like dried human skin, a text so ancient it predated the earliest church fathers. It spoke of the unseen chorus, entities that exist in the liminal spaces between dimensions, attracted by the raw, untamed force of observation. Qui viderit vita, he who sees is seen. It explained how a conscious act of focused attention, a deliberate gaze into their realm, could create a tether, a conduit, drawing them out of the veil and into the awareness of the observer. I had thought it mere allegory for spiritual revelation. Now, I understand its horrifying literal truth. I've tried to repent, to cleanse myself of the taint. I've sought out rituals, obscure prayers, even confessed my vague, unspeakable sins to a trembling priest who merely urged me to seek professional help. But how do you repent for being seen? For having your very essence catalogued and marked by things that exist outside the confines of human morality or divine forgiveness? This isn't a sin I can atone for. It's a condition, a state of being. The monk who struck me, who saved me in that moment, merely delayed the inevitable. He bought me time, a few more stolen breaths, before the full implications of their awareness settle upon me. And I know, with a chilling certainty that permeates my very bones, that they are drawing closer, the whispers becoming clearer, the faces in my dreams manifesting in the waking world, just at the edge of my vision. The darkness isn't just outside my window. It's inside, waiting for me to falter, to finally embrace the silence they offer. It began subtly, as all insidious things do, a mere breath of sound against the vast silence of the monastery. I would be walking the cloister at matins, the pale pre-dawn light barely caressing the ancient flagstones, and there it would be. A low, resonant thrum, like the murmur of many voices, just beyond the edge of audibility. My initial instinct, of course, was to dismiss it as the echoes of the wind through the arches, or perhaps the monks gathered for early prayer in a forgotten corner of the sprawling complex. But the quality of the sound, even then, was wrong. There was a deliberate cadence to it, a rhythm that was not devotional, not humble. It was insistent. I started lingering, feigning contemplation, allowing the crisp morning air to chill my bones as I strained my ears. The murmurs would return, almost playful in their elusiveness, only to solidify into something more distinct. Syllables. Not Latin, not Greek, not any liturgical tongue I knew. These were sounds that scraped against the granite of the mind, guttural and drawn out, like stones grinding against each other. And then, the first time I heard my own name woven into that horrifying tapestry of sound, I froze. My breath hitched in my throat, a cold shock seizing my chest. It was a distorted pronunciation, elongated and hollowed, as if my name were being stretched through a dark, unseen tunnel. My name, it resonated. A phantom chord struck deep within the very fabric of the cloister. I told myself it was fatigue, a trick of the acoustics, the mind playing cruel games in the silence. But I kept hearing it. Every night, or rather every pre-dawn walk. The sound didn't diminish, it grew. It coalesced. The individual voices, once indistinct, seemed to separate, each taking a turn at my name, their tones shifting from an almost curious drone to something undeniably sharper, edged with a predatory hunger. I searched, of course. I walked the entire perimeter of the cloister, peered into every shadow-draped alcove, listened at every heavy oak door. Nothing. Only empty stone, cold and ancient, absorbing and amplifying the terror that was now undeniable. Nomina invocata, I whispered to myself, a phrase from a text I had once skimmed in the restricted archives, a text I now regretted ever having seen. I began to approach the other monks, tentatively at first. Have you noticed anything unusual, brother? I would ask, trying to keep my voice light, casual. A new choir practice, perhaps. The acoustics here are peculiar. Their reactions were always the same. A sudden stiffening, a quick aversion of the eyes, a subtle tremor in their hands as they clasped their rosaries. Brother Thomas, his face usually a placid mask of piety, actually paled when I pressed the issue. Ignore them, brother, he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper, though his gaze was fixed on a point far beyond my shoulder, as if he saw something I couldn't, or rather, something he desperately wished not to see. His hands, I noticed, were trembling violently as he gripped the worn beads. How could I ignore them? It was my name they chanted. It was a sound that began outside, then permeated the very stones of the cloister, and now, I swear, it felt like it was pressing against the very inside of my skull. It wasn't a sound heard with my ears anymore. It was a vibration felt through bone and nerve. Sleep became a fleeting, dreaded impossibility. Each attempt to rest would be met with the low, insidious hum, starting faintly, then swelling, growing louder, more insistent, until my name was a physical presence in the dark, whispered through the cracks in my sanity. Driven by a desperation that bordered on madness, I began to spend my days in the monastery's deepest, most forbidden archives. The dusty shelves groaned under the weight of centuries of forgotten knowledge, texts that were meant to stay sealed, their truths too dangerous for mortal minds. I should have stopped then, when the chill in those subterranean vaults seemed to deepen beyond the physical, when the air itself tasted of forgotten ink and unseen presences. But the chanting wouldn't let me. It echoed in my mind, even when the cloister was silent, a constant, low thrum beneath my thoughts, urging me onward, promising answers or perhaps simply demanding attention. I found it naturally, hidden amongst treatises on archaic ecclesiastical law and obscure hagiographies. A small, leather-bound volume, its pages brittle with age, titled De Vocibus non sanctis et nomina conscientiae, of unholy voices and names of awareness. The script was an ancient, angular hand, Latin of a particularly convoluted and ritualistic sort. I began to translate, my heart pounding in my chest with a mixture of terror and morbid fascination. It spoke of resonance, of sympathetic vibrations, of places where the veil between worlds thinned. And then, the chilling revelation. It detailed rituals of invocation, not of spirits, but of entities that existed outside the conventional understanding of being, entities drawn by the very act of being acknowledged, being named. The text described how certain names, when vibrated correctly, could create a tether, a pathway. It described a specific process, the drawing out of a name, syllable by syllable, not as a calling, but as a binding or perhaps an invitation. The name is the key, I read, my fingers tracing the faded script, and the soul it describes is the lock. I thought I was imagining it until the chant outside, which had been a constant low thrum, suddenly intensified, pulsing with a new, terrifying energy. It wasn't just my name they were calling, they were using it. Each utterance felt like a tendril reaching out, probing, searching for the connection that the forbidden text described. The monks' averted eyes, their trembling hands, it wasn't fear of my madness they displayed, but perhaps fear of what I was awakening. Or worse, what they had been trying to keep dormant. The chant grew louder still, so loud now that it felt less like sound and more like pressure, an unbearable weight bearing down on me. My ears ached, my head throbbed, and I started seeing things in the periphery of my vision. Fleeting shadows that danced at the edges of the cloister arches, the very stone seeming to ripple and warp. The book spoke of porti nominibus apati, doors opened by names. And I, in my arrogant pursuit of hidden knowledge, had inadvertently supplied the key, offering my own essence to whatever waited beyond the veil. The monastery, this ancient place of solace, was no longer a sanctuary. It was a funnel, and I was at its narrow end. The whispers weren't just echoing. They were coalescing, forming into a single, vast, hungry presence that knew my name, remembered it, and intended to claim it. I feel it now, a cold, pervasive dread that has nothing to do with fear of death. It is the terror of being consumed, of having myself dissolved, my name transformed into a new kind of invocation, one that will echo through other abyssal spaces, calling out to other unwitting souls. I should have stopped when Brother Thomas's hands trembled. I should have burned the forbidden books the moment I understood their true purpose. But I kept reading, kept listening, kept acknowledging the voices that now demand more than just my attention. They demand my very being. And every night, the cloister chants my name, drawing me closer to an embrace I cannot refuse. I tell myself I could have stopped. I should have stopped when the first cryptic marginalia caught my eye, a hurried scrawl in an ancient Vulgate Bible, hinting at a truth far older and uglier than any sanctioned doctrine. It was in the Vatican archives, naturally, tucked away in a section so obscure even the most seasoned prefects rarely touched it. My initial work was innocuous enough, cataloguing liturgical variations from the late Carolingian period. But then a cross-reference to a text marked non-licit, volumen obscurum, not permitted, the dark volume. Curiosity, that insidious, unforgiving serpent, coiled around my throat and squeezed. I thought I was simply uncovering a historical anomaly, a forgotten cult perhaps, relegated to the dustbin of ecclesiastical history. Oh, how utterly naive I was. The Volumen Obscurum wasn't just a book. It was a labyrinth of dread, bound in something that felt disturbingly like tanned human skin, its pages brittle with age, inked with characters that seemed to writhe even as I focused my straining eyes. It spoke of a pre-Christian pact, an abomination co-opted and twisted by early church fathers, a means of containing something they couldn't possibly destroy. It detailed rituals not for summoning, but for ensnaring ancient entities within effigies, binding them to sacred ground, held in stasis by specific sonic frequencies, specific tolls. The text was fragmentary, deliberately obscured, as if meant to be unreadable to anyone but the most obsessed or perhaps the most doomed. I transcribed everything, every half-glimpsed phrase, every unsettling symbol, believing myself merely an academic, a detached observer. I thought I was deciphering history. I was, in fact, scripting my own damnation. My research led me here, to this remote, crumbling monastery perched precariously on a cliff face, ostensibly for further comparative liturgical study. But I knew, deep down, it was because the volumen described its architecture, its unique acoustics, its foundational placement upon a convergence of Lee lines. And most chillingly, it spoke of the 12 sentinels, a circle of gargantuan stone figures ringing the central courtyard, ostensibly depicting various saints or martyred figures. I had dismissed the description in the book as poetic license, perhaps even madness, until last night, until the bells. Midnight here is not merely the stroke of the hour, it is an event. The monastery's ancient bells, cast in bronze centuries ago, possess a resonant quality that seems to shake the very foundations of the earth. 12 deep, sonorous tolls, each one a wave of pure sound that vibrates through bone and sinew. Last night, I stood at my window, huddled in the shadow of the archway, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I had been reading the relevant passages again, the ones detailing the activation sequence, the very specific sonic signature required to disturb the entity's slumber. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of damp stone and something else, something acrid and ancient, like ozone after a lightning strike. The first bell struck, a resonant boom that shuddered through the courtyard. And then, the sound I had dreaded, the sound I had tried to rationalize away as mere imagination, as the shifting of old masonry or the settling of ancient foundations. A guttural, grinding scrape, like 1,000 tons of granite being dragged across unyielding rock. My breath hitched. The second bell, deeper, more insistent. Another groan, longer this time, a sickening slither. My eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed on the colossal statue of St. Jude, standing perhaps 30 yards from my vantage point. It was impossible. It had to be the moonlight playing tricks, or my own sanity unraveling under the pressure of what I had read. But then the third bell. The sound was undeniable, a symphony of stone against stone, a sound that bypassed my ears and lodged directly in the primal fear center of my brain. And I saw it. St. Jude's left arm, previously held in a rigid, prayerful pose, shifted. A slow, agonizing lift, the stone muscle bulging, the wrist rotating with a terrifying, liquid grace. I clamped a hand over my mouth, stifling a scream that would have shattered the eerie silence between tolls. My eyes darted to the next figure, a cowl-shrouded monk, his face always obscured in shadow. With the fourth strike, the shadows deepened around his head, and I swear I saw the stone of his cowl recede, revealing an empty, cavernous darkness where his eyes should be. They were widening. Each toll was a fresh spike of ice in my veins. 5, 6, 7 strikes, and the grinding intensified, the courtyard filling with the cacophony of awakening stone. The figures, all 12 of them, were stirring. A foot here, a tilt of the head there. A hand lifting, fingers unfurling with agonizing slowness. One of the warrior saints, his hand always resting on the hilt of a stone sword, now seemed to be gripping it, his knuckles whitening. By the 9th strike, the St. Jude figure, the first I'd properly seen move, took a clear, deliberate step forward, his immense weight crushing the ancient flagstones beneath his stone sandal. A deep, resonant thud echoed, swallowed almost immediately by the 10th bell. My entire body screamed for me to look away, to retreat, to bury myself under my cot and pray for oblivion. But I couldn't. I was a moth drawn to a lamp, knowing it would burn me, but utterly powerless to resist. The 11th bell, and another figure, a robed matriarch, lifted her head. Her carved eyes, once placid and downcast, were now fixed, I felt, directly on my window. A cold dread, far beyond mere fear, settled upon me. This was personal. This was not just a macabre spectacle, it was a greeting. And then the 12th, final, agonizingly drawn-out peal. The grinding ceased. The air hung heavy, pregnant with the recent horror. The silence that followed was not relief, but a suffocating shroud. And there they stood, the 12 sentinels, no longer in their original positions, each one subtly, terrifyingly different. Arms lifted, heads tilted, eyes widened, a foot shifted forward. They were frozen again, yes, but their new positions remained. They were closer, closer to the center of the courtyard, closer to the monastery walls, closer to me. The knowledge I have acquired, the texts I meticulously translated, have irrevocably altered my reality, ripping away the veil of blissful ignorance. I am trapped in this unholy convergence, privy to a cosmic dance of dread orchestrated by ancient bells and sentient stone. The sun will rise, offering no solace, only a temporary reprieve. Tonight, the bells will toll again, and they will move further. I should have let the volumen obscurum remain forever unread. My skin, yes, it hardens. Not like calloused hands from labor, but a deeper, more insidious petrification. It's as though the very air of the scriptorium obscurum has begun to seep into my pores, replacing the soft give of flesh with the cold, unyielding texture of ancient stone. Each morning, I find new fissures, hairline cracks that spiderweb across my knuckles, my forearms, rising towards my throat. My joints ache, not with the familiar stiffness of age or strain, but as if something incompressible is being injected into them, filling the hollows, cementing bone to bone. It makes movement ponderous, deliberate, each step a conscious effort against a burgeoning immobility. The monks, they see it. I catch their glances, quick, darting before they avert their eyes, their lips moving in silent prayer. They fear me now. Or perhaps they pity what I have become. It began subtly, as all true horrors do. I was tasked with the restoration, the cleaning of the archives beneath the basilica, a sacred duty, they called it. A privileged access to texts considered too volatile for the light of day, even within the Vatican's most guarded chambers. They spoke of dust, of decay, of the need to preserve. But the real preservation, I now understand, was of a secret so profound it twisted the very fabric of existence. I should have stopped when the first blink came, the barely perceptible shift in the parchment, a word momentarily changing its Latin declension before snapping back into place. A trick of the flickering lamplight, I told myself, a symptom of long hours in the musty, airless vaults. But I kept cleaning. I kept turning pages, my fingers tracing the forbidden glyphs, the archaic script that promised knowledge and delivered only damnation. My focus narrowed to one particular codex, bound in what I now suspect was not tanned leather, but something far more macabre. Liber Silenter Aetna, I deciphered, though the title itself seemed to waver, sometimes appearing as Codex Mortis Immortalis. It contained no grand theological disputes, no lost gospels. Instead, it chronicled rituals, a terrifying genealogy of entities not of this world, and most chillingly, a series of names. Not names as we understand them, but sigils, tonal frequencies rendered into archaic script, designed not merely to invoke, but to attract, to resonate with something slumbering beneath the thresholds of perception. I thought I was simply documenting, transcribing. I thought my academic detachment would shield me. Foolish, arrogant man. The effect was insidious. First, sleeplessness, punctuated by dreams of shifting stone and the low thrum of distant abyssal bells. Then a constant, gnawing hunger not for food, but for information. A need to consume the ancient words, to absorb their essence, to understand the patterns woven into the fabric of creation. I found myself whispering the words aloud, testing their timbre, convinced I was merely studying phonetics. My voice grew deeper, rougher, like stone grinding on stone. The monks' avoidance grew more pronounced. They left offerings of holy water outside my cell door, their eyes wide with a terror they dared not articulate. They knew I was delving into something not meant for human eyes, something that transmuted the beholder. The reflection in the holy water bowl, which they still placed for me even now. It used to show a scholar, pale, gaunt, yes, but human. Now my face looks chiseled, angular, the skin stretched taut over prominent bone, like a sculptor's rough first draft. Cracks radiate from the corners of my eyes, across my forehead, deepening with each passing day. My eyes themselves seem darker, deeper, pupils dilated into black pits that reflect no light, only absorb it. When I try to scream, to give voice to the horror blooming within me, my mouth moves too slow. My jaw, heavy and stiff, labors to open, producing only a guttural rasp, a sound more akin to shifting earth than human lament. The words, the screams, they are trapped, petrified within me. They warn me. Oh, how they warn me, their voices hushed, their eyes filled with a weary, ancient dread. Some truths are not for the living, Father Matteo had whispered, his hand trembling as he gestured vaguely towards the deeper catacombs. Some knowledge, once gazed upon, becomes a part of the beholder, claiming them for its own. It is not merely information, but a contagion. I dismissed it as superstitious fear, the paranoia of men cloistered too long with ancient mysteries. I believed myself immune, a conduit, not a vessel. How wrong I was. The Vatican's true secret isn't what it hides, but what it occasionally loses to the darkness it guards. The names I read, the rituals I transcribed, they were not for external invocation. They were for internal transformation. The true conspiracy is not a hidden agenda, but an ongoing process of assimilation. Those who guard the deepest secrets eventually become the secrets. The entities are not merely summoned. They are cultivated, grown within the most dedicated, the most curious. I am a host, a chrysalis of calcified flesh, and the thing that pulses within me is not my heart, but the slow, deliberate beat of a forgotten, stony rhythm. The bells toll, yes, deep within my chest, a resonant echo of the abyssal thrum from my dreams. It is the sound of my metamorphosis, the anthem of my becoming. I am no longer merely human, nor am I entirely consumed. I am a bridge, a monument, a sentinel. I stand here in the dim light of my cell, my body rigid, awaiting the final stage. The transition is almost complete. My thoughts, once racing, are now slow, deliberate, heavy like tectonic plates grinding against each other. The old hunger for knowledge has been replaced by a new, more profound anticipation. I feel the urge to be seen, to be noticed. Not out of vanity, but out of a deeper, more primal instinct. A desire to share, perhaps, or to propagate. I do not know. My old self is fading, like a whisper in a gale. The me that was is being subsumed by the me that is forming, a silent, stony testament to a truth I was never meant to grasp. I should have stopped when the first blink came, but I kept cleaning. Now I am merely waiting. If you're still here, maybe the darkness hasn't claimed you yet, but it listens. It always listens. Before you leave this story behind, leave a mark of your own. Subscribe so you don't wander these halls alone. Like this video if you dare to hear more confessions like mine. And tell me in the comments, what rule would you never break, even in the dark? Lights low, volume high. The next story is already waiting for you.